Hello everybody. I'm going to make a video about the Schliemann defense. I want to try, my goal will be to explain not only the moves, but also the reasons behind the moves. So this is the Schliemann defense. It starts with a Ruy Lopez, and here we're going to play f5. So this is a gambit because we're allowing white to take the f-pawn. The reason why we are giving up the pawn is because we want to control the center. This e-pawn of white is a pawn that is controlling the center. It's influencing the center. Once we divert it to taking our f-pawn, it's no longer in the center. So we're diverting the white's central pawn off of the center. That is what we're gaining for giving up our pawn. Obviously, white doesn't have to take the pawn. White has there are a lot of different moves that white can play. But first, we're going to examine what happens if white takes the pawn. So now we're going to attack his knight with our pawn. So we're gaining space and also gaining a tempo on the knight. Now his knight doesn't have a lot of good moves. These squares are covered by the black queen. These squares are covered by the black knight. So if the knight wants to save himself, he has to move backwards, which is not very good because now black is winning in development. Black can even play the queen to g5, which not only develops the queen, but also is pressuring this pawn, and if this pawn moves, it's pressuring the bishop. So it's a very powerful queen. So because of that, white doesn't want to move his knight back. The two most common moves, or the two good moves for white here, are taking the knight, or playing queen to e2, pinning the black pawn to the king. So first, I'm going to look at what happens if white takes the knight. So when white takes the knight, we're going to take back the bishop. Taking the bishop back is more important than taking the knight back. First of all, the knight is a difficult piece for white to figure out where it goes, whereas the bishop can run away easily. So that's one reason to take the bishop first. Another reason to take the bishop before the knight is that the bishop is in general a more powerful piece. And the third reason to take the bishop is that the bishop is attacking this pawn. So if we just try to take the knight, well, then not only is his bishop escaping, he's also winning our pawn back. So it's important to take this bishop. Now, in theory, we could take it with either the d pawn or the b pawn. The advantage to taking it with the d pawn is that would open up our bishop, and it would make it more easy to castle queenside in the future. The advantage to taking with the b pawn is that that would enable, in theory, would enable us to play d5 at a later stage. But the truth of the matter is that we actually can't ever play d5, and even if we would take with the b pawn, we probably would never get to play d5. The reason for that is that his knight can come to e5. So if you imagine we take with the b pawn and his knight comes here, we think we can play d5. Here, I'll show you on the board what it looks like. If we were to take with the b pawn, his knight comes here, and we think, oh, great, now we can play d5. Well, then he just brings his queen here, and we're kind of screwed. We're in check. We don't want to move our king. We lose castling rights. If we go here, he could take our pawn. We can't take back because then he gets our rook. So this is kind of a disaster. So because of this, white can pretty much ensure that we never play d5 just by bringing in his knight. So because of that, there isn't much of a reason to take with the b-pawn. The only real advantage of taking with the b-pawn is that it preserves our d-pawn to play d5, but that's not going to really be possible. We're just not going to get a chance to do that, because we have to worry about this knight and this queen. And because of that, we were going to take with the d-pawn. That way we're opening up this attack on this pawn. And in this position, white's knight is still under attack. And therefore white has essentially two good moves. He can, again, play queen to e2, pinning our pawn. Or he can move his knight. So let's say he plays queen e2. He's attacking this pawn. We will defend it with our bishop while also taking his pawn. Then white will often play d3, and that attacks this pawn. This pawn is now doubly attacked by the queen and the pawn, and it's also pinned. So we're going to defend it and also unpin it by playing queen e7. And enabling us to castle. Now, going back, white over here can play knight e5. Instead of pinning with the queen, he can play knight e5. And in this case, we're just going to take this pawn, and that's that. All right. So going backwards. We're going back to this position. We said if white moves his knight back, that's not very good. We covered what happens if white tries to take our knight. The next option for white is to play queen e2, and that prevents us from taking his knight because our pawn is pinned. In this case, we respond with queen e7, defending our pawn. Now, what happens if over here, white takes this knight? In this case, we can actually take with the b-pawn. Remember, last time we took with the d-pawn, and now we're going to take with the b-pawn. And the reason why is, as I said before, we want to preserve the ability to play d5, controlling the full center. Previously, we couldn't play d5 because we were scared of his knight coming here and his queen coming here. But since our queen is on e7, his knight can't come here. We would just take it. And because of that, d5 is going to actually be a possibility. And that's why we don't want to capture with our d-pawn, as then we can no longer play d5 if our d-pawn is... And now, white still has to deal with his knight, which is again under attack. And again, now all these squares are controlled by the queen. So the only real place that white can move is here to d4. Now as black, we will play knight f6, which is always good to develop a knight. And then white will often castle. And then we can actually play c5, attacking his knight. And now he will he can play knight b3 to move his knight out of the way, or he can play knight b5. Either way, now we get to play d5, and this can look like a scary move because it's attacking this pawn, but d5 defends it with the queen. Okay, now we're going to look at what happens when white does not accept the gambit. And we're going to look at a bunch of different options for white aside from accepting the gambit over here. The first we're going to look at is knight c3. This is called the Dyckhoff variation. So if white does not take our f-pawn, then we're going to use our f-pawn to take his e-pawn. It's a general rule. That way we get rid of his e-pawn and can try to control the full center. Then white will generally want to take back. And at this point, you may think that you want to now play d5 and take the full center. But d5 over here would be a mistake. Because if you play d5, this is what you should not do. That has the side effect that now your knight is pinned to your king. And white can start putting a lot of pressure by taking your e-pawn. And now your knight can't take because it's pinned, and white's going to be soon moving in his queen as well, down over here. And the combined pressure of white's queen on h5 and his knight over here is going to be too much. So that's why over here, before we do want to play d5, but we're going to have to play knight to f6 first, and that's going to prevent all of the danger of the queen coming here because our knight is stopping that. Okay, now in this position, one thing white can do is white can take our knight on f6. Now in this position, we want to take our knight back. And we can, in theory, we could either take back with the g-pawn or with the queen. And in this case, we're going to take back with the queen. Now, the advantage to taking with the queen is that it's developing a queen, which is always pretty good. The disadvantage, sometimes the queen is not as good a defender. First of all, if the queen is tied down to the defense of a pawn, then that means the queen can't do other things. And also, if the pawn is ever attacked multiple times by multiple pieces, then the queen can only defend one. And that's a disadvantage to defending with the queen. But in this case, the pawn is only really attacked by the knight. It's only really attacked by one piece. It's also, it's also defended already by this knight. Obviously, this knight can be undermined if he takes it, but it's already defended, and it's only attacked once, and therefore it's better to bring out the queen. Which has an added side effect of developing the queen. Okay, now in this position, let's say white castles. Now here, we're going to play bishop e7. Now why bishop e7? So a general theme of this opening is that we're always a little bit hesitant to play bishop c5, because that opens up the door. That makes it hard to castle, because if we ever play bishop c5, so our bishop ends up here and we castle and our king ends up here, then his queen can come here and attack both our king and our bishop. So if we want to castle very soon, we don't want to play bishop c5, because playing bishop c5 forces us to play d6 before we can castle. In this position, since white's already castled and is about to be putting a lot of pressure on our king, we want to castle as quickly as possible, and therefore we want to play bishop e7, not here, not bishop c5, which forces us to play d6 first. In this position, white will often play his rook here, and then we're going to castle. Okay, now backing up, we discussed what happens if white takes here with his knight. And the next option we're going to look at is white playing queen e2. And in this case, we can play d5, taking the full center. We're no longer concerned about his queen coming here because we have our knight. Now, in this position, white's knight is under attack, and he will want to take our knight. Now, in this position, we're gonna take his knight back, but this time we're gonna take with the g pawn. And the reason why we have to take with the g pawn and not with the queen here is because this pawn is under attack twice, and it's not defended at all because this knight is pinned. Now, if it's under attack twice and it's not defended at all, defending it with the queen won't really work because then he'll just take it. But if we defend it with a pawn, now he can't take it. Even though it's attacked twice, if he takes with the knight, we take back. And if he tries to take back, then he lost a knight and only gained as a pawn. Or 2 pawns, but that's not worth a knight. So let's just see. Right, he takes here, we can take back, he puts us in check, we can go here, and he can't take this as his queen is pinned. Okay, so that's why we're taking with the g pawn. All right, backing up again. Another common move white can play here is d3. Again, we're going to respond with d5, taking the full center. Again, white will want to take our knight. And in this case, we can take with either the g-pawn or the queen. They both are legitimate. Basically, because the advantages of both cases essentially apply. The pawn is attacked. And it might be attacked later by the queen, so that's the advantage of the g pawn. However, the advantage of the queen is that right now it's only attacked once, and we also want to develop the queen. So those are those advantages. Okay. Now backing up again, we discuss what happens if white takes. We discuss what happens if white plays his knight out to c3. The next case we're going to look at is white playing d3. And again, in this case, we're going to take his pawn. And it's important to take the pawn. You realize that this pawn might be hanging. Right? If white takes our knight, then white can take this pawn. So this pawn is hanging, and this pawn is hanging. So we have essentially 2 hanging pawns, and that's why you could get into dangerous territory if you try not, to leave both of these pawns hanging. And that's why, even though here by taking you're not really getting the center because white can just take back. And white also has a pawn in the center, it still is important to take that pawn. In this position, there are 4 common moves for white. And the first one that we're going to, sorry, it's not white's turn. In this position, we're going to play knight f6. And now there are 4 common moves for white. The first is white castling. And now we're going to actually play bishop c5. And it's a little bit different. Remember, previously we were worried about playing bishop c5 because that prevents us from castling, because white's queen can come here. But it's a little bit different in this situation because we still have our knight here, so we're not as scared about the white queen coming in. However, it is still important to play d6 because this knight might want to move. So basically, in this position, we're going to play d6 before we castle, and there are a lot of different moves white can play here, but no matter what, we're going to play d6. If white bishop g5 is one common move, we're going to follow up with d6. Queen to d3 is a common move. Again, we're going to follow up with d6. The other common move for white is knight c3. And again, we're going to play here d6. And the other common move white can play here is bishop takes on c6. And now we're going to take back, and we're going to take it back with the b pawn. But now it's less about preserving our ability to play d5 and more about we don't want to trade queens. If we took here, we would, white could trade queens and we would lose castling rights. So that's why here we're going to take with the b pawn. White now may want to take this pawn. And in this case, we're going to castle. In this case, there's a lot of threats going on, so we need to castle, and we're not worried about this pin because we have our pawn here and our knight here, so that's obviously impossible. White will play knight c3 very often, and then we'll play d6, and that's how the game will go. So this was all when in the case where white castles. The next option for white is knight c3. And in this case, when white plays knight c3, we're going to right away play bishop b4. And the reason for that is that white has a lot of potential attacking power with this knight, because white can bring their bishop here and their knight here, so that would be putting a lot of pressure on our knight, and that's why we're playing our bishop here, to prevent that knight from moving. In this position, white will often want to castle, and then we're going to take his knight because, again, we're very scared about what this knight can do if it ever comes here. White will take back. Then we're going to play d6. To try to get our bishop out. And that's that. Okay. So all of that was what to do when white plays his knight out here. The next option for white is to play bishop g5. Now in this case, we're going to play bishop c5. The engine actually recommends bishop b4 for the similar reason that if our bishop is here, then his knight can come in here and then here, and putting a lot of pressure here. But the reason why I still prefer to play bishop c5 is that if the bishop comes here, he could attack the bishop with the pawn, and that's kind of awkward. So I like the bishop better over here. And we don't have to be concerned about the queen coming here and preventing castling again because of our knight, and also because castling is not so urgent to do so quickly anyways. White hasn't castled either yet. Now, in this case, if white castles, we're going to play d6. We do need to play d6 before castling because this knight is pinned, so we are concerned of his queen coming here, pinning, forking our king and our bishop. Now white can play knight c3, and then we're going to castle. And it is true that in this position, white can come here and attack our knight. So it's not a great position for black, but it's certainly playable. Okay, so that was when the bishop came, and the last option for white is just taking the knight. And again, here we're just going to take with the b pawn. We don't want to take here because we don't want to trade queens and lose our castling rights. Okay. All right, going back, our next option for white in this position is to just take our knight. Now, if white takes our knight, we're going to take with the d pawn, right? Because, as we said, white's knight can come here, his queen can come here, and we're going to be too busy dealing with all of that to play d5. So it's more similar to that position. And also, the good thing about taking with the d pawn is that that opens up our bishop to defend our pawn. Now there are three options for white. White can take our pawn. And again, that was kind of why we had to take with the d pawn, is because white did have this option. And now we're going to go queen d4, attacking the knight, and also adding another attacker to this pawn. Now, white may erroneously play queen h5. This is a mistake for white, but it's a common mistake. If white does this, we can just block the check, and white will sometimes take this pawn, thinking that we can't take back because he would be able to take our rook. But the truth of the matter is that the rook is defended by our queen, so that's not actually a concern. White can take this pawn, check, and we can just come here. And now, sometimes white's actually going to castle here. They don't know what they're doing. But that's actually pretty good for us, because then we bring our bishop here, and we got our bishop and our rook attacking his king. So if white's a bit smarter, they're not going to castle. They might bring their pawn out, trying to play their bishop. And we can actually don't want to play here, as that loses our queen. We're going to attack the queen, and if here they bring out their bishop, pinning our knight, then we go here, and we're going to win their rook, as our knight here is defended by our bishop and our king. Okay, this was if white comes down with his queen. The other option, white may just retreat his knight, and then we just take the pawn here with check. White will defend with his queen. Then we'll play bishop d7 to enable ourselves to castle. Okay. Backing up to this position. The next option for white in this position is to play knight c3. And in this case, we're going to play knight f6. We don't need to take the pawn because this pawn's not hanging. It's defended by our bishop. So that's why we don't have to take this pawn. And we could just develop our knight. Okay, the next option for white in this position is that white will sometimes take this pawn. But then this actually it kind of transposes to previous lines, because we play e4, and it more or less transposes to previous lines. So I'm not going to go into this in detail. I mean, we're going to be taking the pawn. Okay. So that concludes this line. Sorry, it concludes. We were just discussing the d3 line. So that concludes the d3 line. Next, we're gonna discuss this line, d4. This is called I don't know. It has some weird name that I can't pronounce. Now, if white plays d4 here, so this is actually pretty bad for white because we can actually win this d4 pawn that he just played. We could just win it outright. So the way we do that, we take the pawn on e4. Again, in general, this is always going to be the most common move. Whenever he plays out, whenever he does not take the gambit, we're going to take on e4. Then white will want to take our pawn. We will take his knight, and then he will take our knight, and this brings his d pawn out to e5. And that is important because when it's on e5, it's actually more vulnerable. The reason why is because then we play c6. He plays bishop c4. Then we can play, bishop, not a4, he plays c4. Then we play our queen out here, attacking his king, and attacking this pawn, and that's how we're going to win the pawn. So he plays knight c3. We can take the pawn, white will castle, we can play d5, taking the center, bringing our bishop out, attacking his bishop, and it's all good for us. Okay. The final move we're going to look at over here is what happens when white castles. Again, we're going to take this pawn. Whenever white doesn't take us, we're going to take him. Now, white will often take this knight. We're going to take back with the d pawn. Again, since our queen is over here, we do have to be concerned about this. The only time in general that we take with the b pawn is when our queen is on the e file, and that prevents his knight from coming into the e file. But since our queen is still in the d file, we take with the d pawn. He may take our pawn, and we go here, and this again, it transposes to previously discussed positions.